I sent out an agenda. We were going to talk a little bit about buyer closing costs and sort of how to approach a buyer. And then if you're a listing agent, when an offer comes in where there's a closing cost, they're asking for a closing cost credit, how to explain that to your seller. And then after that, we won't spend a ton of time on that. Then after that, we'll talk a little bit about expired listings and for sale by owner, prospecting them, and how getting listings, can allow you to do open houses, meet buyers, and just all the good benefits of that. So without further ado, back to the closing costs credit. So basically, if you're submitting an offer, you're working with a buyer and it's time to put in an offer, you want to explain to them that they can have the seller pay part of their closing costs. So there are, as part of the, the FAR bar contract, there are certain costs that the seller will pay that typically, and that's standard. That would be the documentary tax stamps, the buyer's, owner's title insurance policy, and a few other miscellaneous items. So these would be beyond that. These would be costs that the buyer is asking the seller to pay, the bank title insurance, the tax on the mortgage, the tax on the note, and again, the survey, other miscellaneous costs. So what ends up happening is whatever that credit is, the title company, when they're doing the closing, will apply that amount to those costs. So if the buyer's closing costs are $6,000 and they ask the seller to pay $4,000, they'll only have to bring $2,000, to the closing, because the seller will pay those $4,000. Now, it's not only the closing costs; it's also they're prepaid. So prepaids are typically the mortgage company will require the buyer to escrow 1 year's worth of real estate taxes, 1 year's worth of insurance, and 1 year's worth of PMI if they have to pay private mortgage insurance. So it's the closing costs plus the prepaids are the total amount that the buyer has to bring to the closing, and then that credit is then deducted from that amount. And there are limitations on that. So if you're working with someone that's, and this is good to know, if you're working with someone that is getting a conventional loan, they can only get 3% of the purchase price as closing costs. So you wouldn't want to, if they're buying a $150,000 home and you told them to ask for $5,000 in closing costs, $500 of what they thought they were getting, couldn't actually be used. It's not allowed. With an FHA and a VA buyer, it's 6% of the closing costs can be paid by the seller. So when do you explain this to your client if you're working with a buyer? So typically when you're kind of getting ready to write the offer, you want to present to them that there is the possibility of the seller paying part of their closing costs. What ends up happening is that the closing costs are then rolled into the loan, because typically what will happen is that if the purchase price is, say, $200,000, and now they're willing to offer $200,000, but now they're going to ask for $5,000 in closing costs to sort of make that offer the same for the seller. They have to offer $205,000. So they offer $205,000, and then they get $5,000 back at closing. So the net offer to the seller is $200,000. Everyone kind of get that? So you got to kind of gross it up. Now, the disadvantage of that potentially is when the appraisal happens. So now, instead of the property having to appraise out for $200,000, it has to appraise out for $205,000. So you've kind of, by adding in the closing costs to the purchase price, you've raised up the bar on what the appraisal has to come in at. But so they kind of know what it is. But if it seems like when you've done the comps, it's tight, maybe scale back. The other thing is, a lot of times sellers. So now you've presented that offer. It's $205,000, and you're asking for $5,000 in closing costs. A lot of times the seller, they don't understand that. I'm not paying their closing costs. Are you kidding me? So it sort of, sets the tone in kind of a negative way potentially. And again, for the seller, it's the same thing. If the person can't get the loan, then obviously the deal is not going to go through. They're not going to get their house sold. The buyer has, made that hurdle higher by raising up the purchase price. So if you're working with a seller, you have to kind of explain to them, okay, this, we're helping them, they're rolling their closing costs into the loan. You're getting a net of 200,000, so that's really what they're offering. But if we do accept this offer, we are making it a little bit harder for the appraisal to come in. So that's some of the downside for the seller. They're really getting 200,000, but it's really more around the appraisal. But a lot of them, just like mentally, they don't really get it. They don't understand it. So it's something that you certainly have to explain to them. So, it's in terms of like actually getting the deal done, it's certainly simpler if there's no closing costs. You're not asking them. It's just another thing that kind of has to be explained. It kind of can get in the way, make it all a little bit harder. But again, as real estate agents, it's really not our decision. It's presenting the information to the buyer, explaining to them the pluses and minuses of what they're doing, and then ultimately, advising them, but they have the final call. So any questions around closing costs? Kind of how all that works? Everybody's good? Yeah, really the thing is just to explain to your client, typically right at, they may ask about it, a lot of times they don't. You wouldn't want to have, it gets harder like if you've submitted the offer and then they start asking about it. So, because you kind of didn't tell them. So you want to make sure right as you're going through the offer, you're writing that up with them. You mention the closing costs. You kind of can go one or two ways. Make sure they understand that, if their offer is 200 and then you tell them about the closing costs and then they decide to add $5,000 in closing cost credit, but they don't increase their purchase price, they've really reduced what they're offering. And, the chances of that getting accepted is a little bit less. So in summary, make sure you talk to your buyer about, the possibility of, having their closing costs financed. Make sure that, if they're conventional, you understand that the max can be 3%. If it's FHA or VA, it can be 6%. That they've increased the chance of the appraisal, maybe having a problem. If you're working with a seller, explain to them that, really what they're getting is the net amount. And then, when you're in the negotiations on both sides, certainly the purchase price and then, the amount of closing cost credit, everything's negotiable until you actually come up with sort of an agreement. So that's it on, on closing cost credit.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What if, let's say, the buyer wants to change how taxes are prorated, right? Like, there's a standard way to do it, and a certain way it benefits the seller, a certain different calculation benefits the seller. You've got a real sophisticated seller, and they want to do it a certain way, and you've got to go in and change the standard language. Are we even allowed to do that?
Yeah, you really can't. I mean, it's something that that usually won't come up per se. I mean, Lisa had a transaction where the house wasn't actually on the market. The person, lived there. She got to know him, and then she ended up helping him, present an offer to, to the seller. She put in sort of the standard closing costs, and then they basically said no. He needed to pay all their closing costs as well. So in that case, there's whatever page it is on the contract. It's designated one side. If you're allowing the seller to pick the title agent, then they're going to pay certain closing costs and the buyer's going to pay certain closing costs. In this case, the costs that typically 99% of the time are for the seller to pay, they ended up negotiating those away, and then the buyer ended up having to pay those, which, so it's usually
way up the price of the house.
Right.
So really
So
the
it's the
seller
same.
paid, on the contract, the seller paid what the seller pays. Typically, we just up the
right.
price
In the
of
end,
the house to cover it.
what ended up happening was they grossed up the price of the offer, so that the real estate commission and the seller closing costs kind of came out of that, and then that netted down to what they wanted to receive. So that made it easier. But if you look on the the as is or the regular contract, They do delineate, and there's a box you can check, who gets to, pick the title agent. If the title agent is picked by the seller, then, the seller picks up certain costs, the buyer picks up certain costs.
I get something.